Good afternoon. Our speaker this afternoon is Father Tim Kesicki. Tim spent a number of years as a teacher at Loyola in Detroit at University of Detroit High School. He was the president at St. Ignatius in Cleveland. He was the provincial of the Chicago-Detroit province, and he currently is the president of the Jesuit Conference of Canada and the United States. The Jesuit Schools Network DC office is in the Jesuit Conference building in DC, so I see Tim a lot. And I happen to live in the same community with Tim in Washington, DC. So I can tell you this man, even though he's important right now as the president of the Jesuit Conference, this man's heart is in secondary and pre-secondary education. And he has been looking forward to this opportunity to speak with you, I'd say, maybe 6-7 months. Tim, welcome.
Well, good afternoon. I realize I have the challenge of speaking to you right after lunch, so I promise to try to keep you awake. I want to give a quick shout out to the very first time I ever held a piece of chalk, and that was at St. Peter's Prep in Jersey City, New Jersey, where I taught in the Higher Achievement Program back in the days of Father John Browning. Hopefully he's still remembered there. And my heart is very much in secondary education and somewhat pre-secondary education, I think, because my temperament is suited for it. My first full-time teaching job was at U of D Jesuit High School and Academy. And I was not one of the more well-behaved faculty members at faculty meetings. As a matter of fact, I sat in the back, for those of you in the back, and I looked for reasons to laugh. So I remember it was May, you know the mentality in May, and we had an old Polish librarian. Her name was Virginia Strzelka. And Mrs. Strzelka got up, and she had an announcement to make about she was computerizing the card catalog. And it was coming along nicely, but she said that they had discovered a recent error, that all of the theology texts were written by Mark Twain. Well, I couldn't leave well enough alone, and so I was in the back and I was shouting out titles, and I was saying, Understanding the Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom by Mark Twain, A Post-Conciliar Soteriology by Mark Twain, The New Jerome Biblical Commentary by Mark Twain. Suddenly my section of the room was laughing, and the principal called me out for my sophomoric behavior as a faculty member. I realized maybe I fit teaching sophomores. When I arrived here yesterday, I really thought that I'm one of the grown-ups in the room now. And so we arrived and we had a meeting of the board of members. And I approached the meeting with all the seriousness that my office would require. Right before the meeting, Sean Aniel, who was chairing the meeting, said, Tim, would you lead us in a prayer? So I quickly put a prayer together, and I said, well, I'll do a spontaneous prayer. I'll lead everyone in St. Ignatius' prayer for generosity, and then I'll close it off. So I realized if you're going to do a canned prayer, like the prayer for generosity, better to have the text, because if everyone forgets it and you forget it, it looks really bad. So I had the text in front of me, and we're praying it. Well, as we're praying it, my mind is racing ahead till the end. Who am I going to invoke? Am I just going to say, St. Ignatius, pray for us? Or because it was the feast of Saints Thomas More and St. John Fisher, am I going to say those saints? So while I'm saying that, I think I'm reading the prayer correctly. And I find myself aloud saying these words: to fight and not to count the cost, to soil and not to seek reward. Well, I thought I auto-corrected in my mind, toil, 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 hoping no one heard it. The Oregon provincial, Scott Santa Rosa, said, did you say soil? Steve Planning from Gonzaga College High School, Bob Ryan from Brophy Prep in Phoenix all started laughing. Did you say soil? Now my active mind goes, what does it mean to soil and not to seek for rest? And then I'm beginning to wonder if Ignatius's third mode of humility comes with adult diapers. So I'm laughing, I'm literally cracking myself up while we're supposed to be introducing each other. And I realize perhaps that's why I feel so home in secondary education, although I seem to have digressed back to lower school education. I am going to be using a Prezi presentation because I realize that this job may end, and if I come back to the mission of secondary or pre-secondary education, I want you to see that some of you may hire me. I want you to see that I have kept my skills up and that I might actually be capable or functioning in a school classroom. So the title of this presentation, almost every one of my presentations is titled this, "The World is Our Home," because in order to give apostolic reflections, we are a global society. One who is a Jesuit he enters a province, but that province has to reflect the global society. And this expression, "the world is our home," comes from one of the first Jesuits, Jerome Nadal. Nadal really helped bring Ignatius's vision to commonplace. So expressions like "the world is our home," or a Jesuit's desk or bedroom is his cloister because he's working, are expressions of Nadal. And "the world is our home" is an important thing to realize, because while many of us are looking at this region, because this was the map that came out with the beginning of the Jesuit Schools Network, while we're looking at this region and our focus is on this region, the Conference of Canada and the United States, which really does extend from Micronesia to Newfoundland, we have to look at this in the context of the whole world. We're not just a part of North America. We serve the global mission of the society. And really the starting point I want to look at is general congregations. Why? Because on October 2nd of this year, the plenary session of the 36th General Congregation will begin. This is a major event. When you think of going back to St. Ignatius Loyola, so really from our founding in 1540 till today, there have only been now 36 general congregations. And a general congregation is the highest governing body in the Society of Jesus. So many of us look at them and think, oh, that's what they do over in Rome. We're only concerned with what we do here. What I want to do is walk through GC's 31 up to 36 to show how what happened at those congregations does directly impact what we do here, what you do in your institutions, and how you form students. So let's begin then with the 31st General Congregation from 1965 to 1966. Why was it convoked? Well, the Superior General of the Society, Father John Baptiste Janssens, had died on October 5th, 1964, and they needed to convoke a General Congregation in order to elect a successor. It went for 141 days. I think we're horrified that if GC 36 goes for 141 days, it could do more damage than good. But then they needed 141 days. And these were the electors. Now, I'm going to zoom in on this a bit. For those of you who've seen the Dead Poets Society, you know Robin Williams' character, Mr. Keating. As I zoom in, you can hear the words, "Carpe diem." But as I zoom in, this is the global society. They come from 6 continents, but their faces really don't reflect 6 continents, do they? Their faces really reflect a pretty European mindset. So that suggests that even up till GC 31, the leadership of the society coming from around the world still had a highly Western influence. And what did GC 31 do? Well, the most signature thing GC 31 did was elect a new general. And that general was Father Pedro Arrupe. Now, if you look at the photo to the left, you can see that while Arrupe was a Basque from Spain, you see his shoes off. You see him kneeling in a more Asian posture. He was provincial of Japan. And so he really had enculturated, which is a big Jesuit word, into Japanese culture. On the right, you see his hands held together, greeting. It looks like he's in South Asia again. So he is a European who comes from these cultures. And when you look at Arrupe, that name is synonymous with our schools. How many programs, how many buildings, how many scholarships have the name Arrupe on them? What happened at GC 31 is significant because we would not have the mantra, men and women for and with others, were the Jesuits not to have elected Father Arrupe at GC 31. Father Arrupe then convoked the 32nd General Congregation, and that took place in 1975. And it went for 96 days. You're beginning to see some changes. Paul VI was the Pope at the time. Unlike the prior photo, they're not wearing cassocks anymore. They're in suits, and you can see a more casual, familiar demeanor among them at this congregation. Something else that's historically significant about this congregation is you can see Arrupe to the right, and to the left, the priest in procession was the provincial of Argentina, Jorge Mario Bergoglio. So this is really another significant historic event because the current Holy Father was at GC 32. There's much that happened at GC32, and the reason why it was called was because after the Second Vatican Council, the Society of Jesus really had to go back to its charism, its roots, and that was what they worked on at GC32. But we all know the famous decree for the service of faith and the promotion of justice. And think about how much our institutions have changed when you look at that decree of faith that does justice. Our whole commitment to service-based learning, our theology curriculum, our mission trips, our retreat programs, all of this came out of GC32. And I cannot help but think, well, I've not spoken to the Holy Father on this, and I don't know that he would cite this, his ecclesiology, his missiology, where he is concerned about the periphery, going to migrants in Lampedusa, going to prisoners, everything he does for the poor somehow was affected by what happened at GC32. So we can see its relevance to us today. Remember, we're looking toward GC36. Now, another historic event happened on August 7th, 1981. The Superior General, Father Rupe, was in the Philippines. He had done a visit, and actually the current provincial of the Philippines, Father Tony Moreno, was with him when he said goodbye at the airport. He got off the plane flying from Japan at Fiumicino Airport, just outside of Rome, and he had a stroke. And that stroke, as we know, would incapacitate him, and he would never again serve as Superior General. Because he was incapacitated, the society needed a leader, and so they automatically appointed a vicar from the New York province, Father Vincent O'Keefe. But that didn't last long, because in October of 1981, Pope John Paul II, who was the Pope at the time, intervened in the governance of the society, and Pope John Paul II appointed this man, Father Paolo Dezza, a Jesuit, to be his delegate to run the Society of Jesus. Going back to this image of JP2, something else historic had happened. This is August 7th, 1981. May 13th of 1981, Pope John Paul II had been shot in St. Peter's Square. So this was a very emotional time. And so the appointment of Father Dezza was a significant event in the history, because suddenly our governance had changed, and there were concerns that Pope John Paul II had with the order. He met with the order in 1982, and he asked them, he said, you are to convoke a general congregation to discuss concerns from the Holy See, to discuss your internal Jesuit matters, and to formally accept the resignation of Father Arupe and elect a new Superior General. Sometimes you can tell how old a Jesuit is, because Jesuits of my generation who entered after this sort of view it as when the society went into receivership to the church, but there are those who lived through it who refer to this more as the church's martial law imposed on the society. I'll let you ask the Jesuits, you know what their interpretation is, but it was a significant event that led to the 33rd General Congregation. So they had the permission to accept Father Arupe's resignation. And it was a big newsworthy event. You can see the images of Arupe, of Pope John Paul II, of Father O'Keefe. What was going to happen? And at GC32, we know that they elected Father Peter Hans Kolvenbach. At the time, Kolvenbach was superior of the Pontifical Oriental Institute in Rome, but he was a linguist who had been provincial of the Middle East province. You see him in a cassock because he's Armenian Rite, and that would be the traditional attire one would wear in the Armenian Rite. And he served as Superior General for 25 years. Again, just as Arupe gave us men and women for others, Father Kolvenbach influenced the very themes we're discussing today. So when Kolvenbach was given in 1993 the Ignatian pedagogical paradigm, he responded to the IPP by saying that our mission in secondary education was to form persons of competence, conscience, compassion, and commitment. Those words came from Father Kolvenbach, which came from a general congregation, again, to underscore the significance of what happens at these events. Obviously, Kolvenbach had worked on his relationship with Pope John Paul II. And unlike Arupe, who was really a superstar in the church, Kolvenbach took a very backseat approach. He put the society out there. He put himself in the background. Now, something else happened in 1983 which would lead to the 34th General Congregation. I doubt that any of you know it, but in 1983, we had a new code of canon law. Okay, I don't think any of you woke up someday in 1983 and said, wow, the code of canon law has changed. It didn't affect the driving age, the voting age, or the drinking age in any state, so I doubt that any of your students noticed it. But it was significant for the Jesuit order because really the last time the code of canon law had been changed was 1917. And so the 1983 code really went from 2,400 regulations to 1,700. And the goal was to be less legalistic, more directed to encouraging the faithful than to disciplining them. Following the code of canon law, the society had to bring its own law up to date. And so Father Kolvenbach convened the 34th General Congregation, which took place in 1995. If we look at the 34th General Congregation, you can see this is how a congregation meets, although this is being changed. You see a computer terminal. It's probably the first time a computer was ever there. But during the 34th congregation, we got regular updates from the congregation. And let's have another Carpe Diem moment. And you can see now, if you start looking at the faces, and it's going to blur out because it's not the best photo, you see the 6 continents of the world more represented at GC34. No longer really was it the European missionaries who were in charge, but you saw Jesuits coming from Africa, from East Asia, from South Asia, from Latin America, and you can see their faces reflected here. One of the great outcomes of this, which I don't know how many of you know, I know you know, many of you know the spiritual exercises, was this book here, The Constitutions of the Society of Jesus and Their Complementary Norms. And this really brought together our constitutions and all the past congregations and letters of superiors general. Now, okay, some of you may have read this, many of you may have not. But when you look at the matrix that we use for formation, in a sense, this book opened that lockbox. It was no longer secret how Jesuits operated or what they did. This brought it all together and was able to be shared not just with ourselves, but with the laity. Listen to some of the decrees that came out of the 34th General Congregation. Our mission and culture, our mission and justice, our mission in interreligious dialogue, on having a proper attitude of service in the church, ecumenism, cooperation with the laity and mission, Jesuits in the situation of women in the church and civil society, communication in a new culture, Jesuits in university life, secondary, primary, and non-formal education, parish ministry, ecology, etc. So this was really a significant congregation, GC34, and this is documentation that's available, particularly for those of you who continue to be formed in our history and Jesuit traditions, the 34th General Congregation. And then on the 2nd of February 2006, Father Kolvenbach, who had been general for 25 years, wrote the society saying, I can't do it anymore. I'm going to ask to resign. I'm going to ask the congregation to resign, and I think it's time to elect a new superior general. And so in 2009, GC35, actually that's 2008, it's a typo, but you can correct that. And for 56 days, GC35 met and elected Adolfo Nicolas, seen here with Brad Schaefer, a former president of the conference and a former principal of St. Ignatius College Prep. We see Adolfo Nicolas with a former superior general. That didn't happen, that you had a resigning superior general and a new superior general. And we know that Adolfo Nicolas wrote the letter which opens the binder that you have today. And here is seen Adolfo Nicolas with Pope Benedict XVI. So this is a new general and a new pope. And I remember Adolfo Nicolas telling me when I first met him that he suspected Pope Benedict would someday resign. I don't know if that's what they were discussing in this photo, but one sometimes wonders if Kolvenbach's resignation had any role. One never knows. We always speculate. But showed a new relationship and a new age for the Society of Jesus. The decrees that came out of GC 35, again, you might not know them. There were 6 decrees, but there was a lot on the relationship between a superior of a Jesuit community and the director of the work, so the presidents of the schools, and the relationship between the provincial and the directors of the work. So a lot of GC 35 spoke to our increased cooperation with everyone in this room. And Father Nicolas determined that as he reached the age of 80, he too was tired. He sat down with Pope Francis, now the first Jesuit pope, and said he would like to resign the office of Superior General. And so he convoked the 36th General Congregation. So what I want you to realize, Look at how GCs 31, 32, 33, 34, and 35 have directly impacted your schools, your work, your mission. And so as we look to GC 36, some of us here will be there, you have to realize that this too will impact what you do. Just a few images, a few stats from GC 36. So this is the group of us called the Chaetus Praevius. We go to prepare the congregation. This was us on the roof of the Curia at a meeting in September, where we took all of the documentation from the province congregations and formed the working document for the congregation. And this is the group from the Conference of Canada and the United States here at St. Louis University who will go to the 36th General Congregation. Just a few images of them. 19 of us entered the Society of Jesus after GC 33, which means it's a much younger group. Only 7 of the 33 going attended the 35th General Congregation, and only 1 attended the 34th. 4 of us were elected to commissions, 1 on the state of the society, 1 on the coordinating committee, 1 on governance for renewal of life in the church, and mission for renewal of life in the church. And if you can see Dave Ciancimino, many of you who are here from Canisius and Buffalo, he's your president, former provincial, myself, Father John McCarthy of the English Canada province, Father Mark Revisa of the California province. 2 of the 4 have had direct involvement in secondary or pre-secondary education. So you can see secondary, pre-secondary ed will be represented at GC 36. And I think in as much as you know people who are going and you realize the historic impact, the most significant thing we'll do is elect a new superior general. Our relationship with you, your thoughts, your passion will influence what happens when we're over there. And if you think back of the image of the congregation GC 31, mostly of Western origin, GC 34, and now GC 35, who knows from which continent or country the next superior general will come. So let's say if we could look now, again, we're going to keep the global society in our mind, what really is the state of the Society of Jesus today? And there's a whole report, a preliminary draft that has been submitted. I just want to give you some of the statistics on the global society to give you a sense of where we were in 1965 versus today and where we think it's going. So if we look at the world, the Society of Jesus is divided into 6 conferences and 9 assistancies. It's really not significant that you know the difference between those two. So let's look at the demographics in the 9 assistancies of the Society of Jesus from 1965 till today. If we begin with Asia Pacific, in 1965, you can see there were 1,995 Jesuits. Today, there are 1,629. So while there's a clear decrease in countries like Australia, exploding growth in countries like Vietnam and even in the Philippines, and Asia Pacific is a growing region of the church. If we go over to South Asia, which is primarily India, but also Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, you can see the explosive growth in the society from 2,700 in 1965 to just over 4,000 today. So we really do look to South Asia as a major voice in the Society of Jesus and in the church. If we look to Africa and Madagascar from 654 to 1,583, significant growth. Although, if you look at the ratio of Jesuits in Africa and Madagascar to the population, where there's over 1 billion people, and it could go to 1.5 billion, 2 billion, we're very small compared to that. Now, if we shift up to Europe, you can see the demographics are trending another way from growth to smaller numbers. In Central Europe, from 3,600 to about 1,500. And this takes into account that after the fall of the Soviet Union, the Iron Curtain, Jesuits returned to Lithuania and the Czech Republic and Hungary and Romania and Slovakia. And despite that, we still have gone down. Huge drops in Austria, Germany, etc. If we go to Southern Europe, significant change from 7,300 to 1,800. Spain, Italy, Portugal, predominant here. And then Western Europe from 5,000 to 100. So you can see the East is growing. Traditional Europe is changing, shifting down to South America from 2,600 to 1,100. they call it Latin America, but that's really Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean from 1,800 to 1,100. And we've lost a lot here in Canada and the United States from 9,600 to 2,600. So if you look at the total numbers, you say, oh, well, was somebody asleep at the switch? How did we go from 36,000 to 16,700? Well, that's one way of looking at it. But if you look at 100 years of the society, you'll see that our current numbers are where we were in 1910. So there's two ways of looking at this. You can either say, oh God, those were the glory days, and from 90 to 95 and everything else is, well, unfortunate. Or you could say that was really a bubble. We see that in economic markets. Sometimes you hit a high peak. That was really a bubble, and maybe the bubble has burst, but has our ministry or our effectiveness? Because what I think is striking is that despite these changing demographics in Jesuits, look at our ministries. Again, let's look at the map of Jesuit schools. This was at the creation of the Jesuit Schools Network. There were approximately 50 schools when I entered the society. Even though there are not as many Jesuits, there are 63 secondary schools. The addition of Cristo Rey schools, the growth of the nativity schools. I think these numbers may be even higher today. And if we look at this, it's too small on the screen, but you've seen it coming in. The worldwide network of Jesuit schools is exploding. So maybe our demographic bubble of Jesuits may have burst, but our mission is multiplying. And I think we need to look at it that way. The Holy Spirit is very much alive in the mission of Jesuit education. And while we still pray for vocations and realize that we walk together, Jesuits and our collaborators, we have to look at the whole picture. So these are some of the factors that will affect us going into GC 36. But I think perhaps the most significant thing affecting us going into GC 36 is the fact that this is the first time that Jesuits are going to go to a congregation where a Jesuit is the Pope. And so I just want to look at Argentina and Buenos Aires for a moment. There are many books out on Pope Francis. One of my favorite books is by Austin Ivory. He's a British journalist. It's called Francis the Great Reformer, because he has these very clear stories of what Francis was like when he was a Jesuit, as well as his early days as a bishop. And I'm going to look at just really two quotes from Francis and what they say to us today. And the first took place in June of 1992. This is now Bishop Bergoglio when he was an auxiliary bishop in Buenos Aires. The day of his ordination, there were a number of bishops ordained that day, and he was asked to speak on behalf of them all. In his speech, he said these words. I've never heard a bishop say words like this before. He said, "There are brothers and sisters who with their lives ask us, please do not cross over to the other side, but instead discover in their wounds the wounds of Jesus himself." And I said, what does he mean, cross over to the other side? This was in the era when Star Wars came out. Is he saying, Luke, don't go to the dark side of the Force? What does he mean, cross over to the other side? Well, he knew the capacity or the temptation that anyone in leadership or authority had to somehow lord that authority over other people and not really listen to the immediate needs at hand. And so rather than, say, looking at bishops or looking at others in authority, I asked myself a little examination. How do we in our schools risk crossing over to the other side? And if you'll just walk through this little examine with me. I think the first way we risk crossing over to the other side is when we put marketing over mission. And anyone who's been involved in admissions or fundraising or any form of recruitment knows the temptation of putting marketing over mission. I remember the first time I had to pose with a group of students for the booklet that was going to go out on the annual fund. And so the advancement office had arranged the students, and there was Tom, a student of Irish American descent. There was Aaron, a student of African American descent. There was Francis, a student of Filipino American descent. And there was Ravi, a student of Indian descent. And as we were being arranged, Francis said, "I'm the Asian. Where do you want me to go?" The kids figured it out. We were doing a little UN photo to show the world how diverse we were, when in fact we weren't. Okay, the students know it. It doesn't mean we shouldn't have done the photo. It doesn't mean it's wrong. But they can see right through to when we put marketing ahead of mission. Okay, well, I think it becomes especially tempting to cross over to the other side when we're faced with something difficult or challenging. I still remember my hardest day as a president. I will never forget it, and I pray to God I never forget it. It was December 8th, 2005. On that day, I was celebrating the Immaculate Conception Mass, all-school Mass, and I had to go up and apologize to a student and address the entire student body because one of our African-American students had found 5 days earlier a racial insult on his locker. I remember the feeling of lead feet walking up to a podium like this, apologizing to him, and then what I said next was representing a challenge between me, the Jesuit community, and the board with mission over marketing. Because by Ohio law and federal law, that insult constituted a hate crime, I said, we have to report this to the police. And I remember members of the board saying, can't we just find out who did it, expel the student? Think of all the work we've done in the inner city. Think of what progress we're making. This could set us back. And realizing, no, we have to comply with the law, and we have to risk the humiliation, the embarrassment, and the setback to be true to who we are. It's often in those moments, that's the crucible where we're tested with marketing over mission. It's tempting to cross over to the other side. Let's look at another temptation. The competition which seeks to eliminate another from ministry. Okay, we all know that we compete not just for students. We compete for national merit semifinalists in the secondary world. We compete for athletes at all of our schools. We compete for students of artistic talent, students who are going to make a difference in the world. And sometimes we find that our competitors do things that we don't approve of. And we have to be aggressive and we have to represent who we are. But do we do so in a way that best exemplifies the mission of the school? Or do we do it in a way that says, we want to destroy the competition? If we call ourselves men and women for others, our competition have to be those others whom we are men and women with and for. Let's look at another one. Quantifiable success over qualitative success. So often we are great at naming our quantifiable success. We know our academic success, our athletic success. We know where our alumni go, and we should be proud of that. But more often than not, the heart of our school is in the qualitative success, and sometimes in the ways we fail to be qualitatively successful. There's an adage I've always believed whenever I have the opportunity to preach or to speak the gospel, and that is this: facts don't change people's lives, stories do. And when you think of the gospel, it's so narrative. It is the stories that change our lives. And often it's the stories from our school that give people a sense of its heart. I just recently read of the valedictorian at Georgetown Prep who came from Russia through a variety of other places, was homeless, living in a van, and eventually made his way through Prep to become valedictorian and go to Stanford University. When you hear his story, it almost makes me cry. And even leaving the world of our schools, when I think of Father Greg Boyle's book, Tattoos on the Heart, how he says, the one thing that will stop a bullet is a job. We recognize the power of this narrative. And so I think it's important for us always to realize that it's not just enough to quantify what we do. We have to take heart the individuals who form the quality that is our schools. When we subordinate faith to value added instead of a core value. Okay, so we know we're faith-based schools, but we know the temptation of making it value-added. How many of us have attended a meeting or a board meeting where we open with a prayer and then we seem to show Jesus Christ the door because what happens in that meeting has no relationship to the God we just invoked? We might as well invoke the gods of Baal because maybe the gods of Baal have greater things on conflict resolution than what happened in that board meeting. How often in the athletic arena do we say we're going to start with a mass? And we do start with a mass. And then what happens out there is like, whoa, you call yourselves Christian, the cheers, the taunts, etc. And I'm not saying that any of that is bad, but again, our students are watching. They can tell the real thing from a fraud. And if faith or Jesuit or Christian is simply value added and it's not core in our hearts, they'll see right through it and we will have crossed over to the other side. The final thing in this exam I want to do is what I call taming our lingo. We have such powerful Jesuit lingo. And Dr. Eric Clark said some of it today. AMDG, magis, cora personalis. I remember looking at how we use the word magis in our schools. We use it for student groups, retreats, scholarships, auctions, institutes, committees, donor-giving levels, awards, publications, organizations. I kid you not, I was at an auction once where someone said, "We are in the Magis circle." Where is that? Okay. I don't think when Ignatius said Magis, he thought, some of you who give more will have a much better seat. You know, if you just Google Magis outside of our Jesuit thing, you know, I found Magis is a financial advising company in Terrytown, New York. It's a restaurant in Togern, Belgium, which gets a 6 out of 52 in TripAdvisor. It's the name of a Power Ranger action figure. It's a name of a brand of German Kuhklock featuring minimalist Japanese design. It's a name of a breeder of Doberman Pinschers. There's even an $856 doghouse called Magis available online. Okay, we see the humor in that. But how often do we use Jesuit, Ignatian, AMDG, and just throw it around and really tame it? As we heard this morning, it's precisely these words which could help us to lead authentic conversation and social transformation in this country. Do we allow the power of those words to come forth in our ministry, or do we tame them, again, as simply value-added descriptors that form almost a franchise in our lives? Let me turn again back to Pope Francis, and one other quote, because again, I think he's going to play an impact in the hearts of those of us at GC36, and I do think he plays a significant role in your lives. And again, the second insight comes from Ivory's book, Francis the Great Reformer, and it takes place in 2001. This is an image, if you look here, of a consistory. These are all cardinals meeting. And Bergoglio was a consistory in Rome in 2001. And he was at the consistory, and at each consistory there are groups, and then there's someone who's appointed as a rapporteur who gives a report back. And it was Bergoglio and Cardinal Egan. Cardinal Egan was the Archbishop of New York at the time. And in the midst of this, 9/11 happened. And Egan kind of had to go back to his people in New York. So Cardinal, this is an image of Cardinal Bergoglio, had to speak at the consistory. I'm going to read the quote he said, and then I'm going to break it down, because this is a very, very powerful examine and a very powerful reflection for those of us who accompany our students. And he drew a distinction between overseeing and keeping watch. And then Cardinal Bergoglio said, "Overseeing refers more to a concern for doctrine and habits, whereas keeping watch is more about making sure that there be salt and light in people's hearts. Watching over speaks of being alert to imminent danger. Keeping watch, on the other hand, speaks of patiently bearing the process through which the Lord carries out salvation of his people. To watch over it's enough to be awake, sharp, and quick. To keep watch, you need also to be meek, patient, and constant in proven charity. Overseeing and watching over suggest a certain degree of necessary control. Keeping watch, on the other hand, suggests hope, the hope of the merciful Father who keeps watch over the processes in the hearts of God's children." Let's look at what he's saying there between the distinction between overseeing and keeping watch, because I think we need both in all of our ministry in the world of Jesuit education. Let's look at the first. Watching over, there's more of a concern for doctrine of habits, whereas with keeping watch, more concern that there be salt and light in people's hearts. We need doctrine and we need habits in our schools. But if we stop there and don't keep watch on our students, how do we see if any of that's even taking root in them? Watching over, it's enough to be awake, sharp, and quick. Keeping watch, we need to be meek, patient, and constant in proven charity. I'll never forget when I was student teaching and they told me, you will encounter students who are smarter than you. And I learned this right away as a first-year teacher. I was teaching social justice. Our text was Our Best Kept Secret, 100 Years of Catholic Social Teaching by Henry O. Schultheis and DeBerry. And at the end of the course, all the students voted, why don't you just keep it a secret? Okay, I wasn't teaching it well, so I was trying to teach it better. And so I said, well, you know, I tried to do a lesson where I distinguished between justice and charity, where justice entailed obligation and charity didn't. I did all these examples, and this hand goes up right away, and this was a really smart kid. He said, well, you make this distinction, but if one feels that he or she ought to be charitable, then doesn't it all just disappear and meld into one? Of course, I thought on my feet and I said, oh yeah, exactly, that's the point of the lesson. In fact, it was not. I was just trying to find ways to make it more interesting. But we will find students who are smarter than us, more talented than us. If all we are is awake, sharp, and quick, we don't pick up on that. We need to be meek, patient, and constant in proven charity with the students we accompany. Watching over, there's a certain degree of necessary control, whereas keeping watch, the hope of the merciful Father who keeps watch over the hearts of his children. Again, we always have to remember, and I think it was said so beautifully today, that in effect we are really doing God's work, that it's not our work alone. And while we have to help God in the work we do, we can't always get in the way of God. And that only happens if we keep watch and not simply watch over. Yes, we need to be alert to imminent danger, but we also need to patiently trust in the salvation of God. I think one of the great challenges we face now is that students feel a certain excitement about faith in our schools because it's alive and it's vibrant. And then we hear they move on and they're not as excited about it. It seems to dwindle. And I suggest that this is part of what keeping watch is to continue to pray with them, converse with them, and accompany them. I want to turn to one final image. And I'm going to go to Italy. And I'm going to go to a place in Sicily where the star is. And that's a place called Messina, Sicily. And Messina, Sicily is of importance because that's where the first Jesuit school opened. The first Jesuit school opened, and I wrote that down. It opened in, we've got a scholar here, 1548. Yes, it opened in 1548. And it closed, here it is, yes. It closed in 1847 as a result of a revolution. An earthquake nearly destroyed it in 1908, and then it was eventually rebuilt in 1909. And as we know that the Jesuits left their first school in Messina, Sicily. If you go to Messina, you will see this image. And again, this is an image, a marker that a Jesuit school was there. And I find it remarkable that this is our first Jesuit school, and this is what's left of it. It's not there. Because the school was never the end in and of itself. It was the mission of Jesuit education. And if you look at the school itself, you might say it failed. But if you look at that map that shows the millions who are educated by the society, you see that the school was never the end in itself. It was always the mission. And I think, as I close, that's the greatest challenge we face is to realize that we're ultimately about this mission. We don't know how long the schools we serve will be around. We don't know which will open, which will close. But I sincerely believe that either the students of the school or the students who taught students from this school helped bring Jesuit education to Southeast Asia, to East Asia, to Africa, to the Americas, to the whole world. And this was the crucible, the seed through which all of us have found this mission. Let us never lose sight of that, our commitment to the global church, the global society, and the global mission of Jesuit education. Thank you very much. My staff has asked me to show one last slide, and that is that I am on Twitter, so there'll be some tweets from today, so even photos of you. So that's my Twitter if you want to follow me.